of things that they were able to do that were uh, different from what's out there typically.
Sounds
So uh,
very
there
nice.
will be, I'll be talking about visits to
Modern.
Moscow always, and then three of the separate uh, secret cities, former secret cities. And these were not on maps, uh, not identified. And even at that time, it was a breach of security for people in the DOE to even mention the names of those cities. So let's take a look at the next slide. The next slide is a map of Russia. And Russia is a huge country. I'd like to point out that virtually everything is north of the 50th parallel, which puts it Canada and north. Uh, for yeah, if you put it on the same, you know, latitude description as in the U.S. Or in the Western Hemisphere over here. I've marked 4 spots on there in red. Those are the places that are really visited. On the left is Moscow. Then the next one over is Sarov, and it's actually too far. I marked it too far to the east. It's not that far east. It's about 250 miles from Moscow. Then the third one over is Snezinsk, and it's between Yekatrinburg and Chelyabinsk. And I'm going to want to come back to that in just a moment here, just to say some things about that. And then further off to the right at the boundary between the Siberian plain and the Siberian plateau, is just north of Krasnoyarsk is a place called Zheleznogorsk. And that's another one of the cities that I visited. So let's move on to the next slide. This is the list of the 10 secret cities of the nuclear weapons complex. And the first one is Sarov, which is an analog to Los Alamos. The next one is Snezinsk, and that is more or less similar to Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And then down at the bottom, the second to the last, Zheleznogorsk, it's something like what we have been doing at either Oak Ridge or Hanford. And so I'll tell you a bit more about what goes on there, but the emphasis is not going to be on the science and nuclear things, but I'd like to have you see some of the people and the arts and crafts and things like that I found really very fascinating. So the next slide then shows on the left, you can just barely see it. On the upper left is Yekaterinburg, and then down below, it's sort of the German spelling, Chelyabinsk. And right between them is this place called Snezinsk. And then that red line is where there was a chemical explosion at one of their processing plants, and it spilled radioactive stuff over that whole entire area. And I remember driving from Snezinsk to Chelyabinsk, and when you came to this area where it's the darkest red, there were signs by the side of the road that said, "Don't stop here." And that was an accident that occurred in 1957, I think it was, either 57 or 58, but quite some time ago. And there still is a lot of residual radioactivity and stuff left as a result of that. And then I also want to point out just below Snezinsk, there is a little town called Kasli. This area is just east of the Ural Mountains. The industry is located in that area. There was a cannons and bridges and things like that, but they also, when they got bored, did some artwork, and I'll show you some of that. So the next slide then is from our first visit to Snezinsk. We stayed in the Hotel Snezhinka and look out over the plaza there on the left and some of the Russian housing and a lake in the background. But if you look on the lower right-hand corner of that, there's a statue. And that statue is what you see our group in front of. That's Lenin, busy looking over everything there. And so Lenin's presence is felt and very strongly in a lot of the places. And so there are statues to him all around the place. Stalin, no, not anymore. So the next slide, we listened to lectures. I mean, there were, this is, excuse me, our US delegation. There were people from Sandia and me from UNM, sort of the holdout or the lone wolf out there. But you can see the people in that row where I'm sitting were all Sandians. And what you can see is that we have these earpieces where we were getting translations of the speaker's words. And then when it was our turn to speak, we all had slides both in English and in Russian, but you had to time your talking so that the translator could have time to interpret what you were saying in between times. The next slide then shows we were able to visit the inside of their atomic museum in Snezinsk. And that device behind the crowd there is, well, it's a mock-up of their biggest bomb that they ever built. And I'm going to come back to that a couple of times in the future here, because the business end of things. Well, let me point out that right in front of us is an artillery, a nuclear artillery shell. So they can be made quite a bit smaller than that thing behind us. But the business end of that, right, sort of right behind the lady with the red jacket on, Pat Newman from Sandia, was a big iron sphere or steel sphere. And you can see it's probably about 8 or 10 feet in diameter just inside there. And that's where all of the active stuff was carried. The fellow on the third from the right was our main host at Snezinsk, Vasilov Nikitin, and he was, a very pleasant fellow. And then between, just to the right of Pat Newman is a visitor from Sarov, which was the Russian, Los Alamos. This particular device was designed to have a yield of up to 100 megatons equivalent of TNT. They were convinced not to test it at that level, but it was tested twice, once at about 53 megatons and the other one about 60 megatons. It's just too big to have any practical application in warfare. It's just too huge, too destructive. And so it was sort of sidelined, but I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. The next slide then shows some of the features of the town of Snezinsk. It's like I said, it's just immediately east of the Ural Mountains, so it's wooded and so on. And you can see on the left, in a park, they've carved out musicians, animal musicians, performing on various stringed instruments, and it's just kind of a cute little display. We were treated to concerts almost all the time. And there's several things I want to mention about this. These were like high school age kids. And before, on my first trip, I had expected to see a lot of very Slavic kinds of looking people, and was really kind of surprised to find so many blondes in the group. And you can see a lot of blonde heads in there. But after you realize that they were very close to Scandinavian countries, and a lot of interbreeding took place. There was quite a low elevation pathway all the way from Petersburg down through the Black Sea to Constantinople and so on, and where the highest elevation was only like 700 feet above sea level. So it was a path that a lot of traders and military forays took place along there. Then these folks gave us really a very nice concert, and the lady on the lower left there was the director, and she mentioned that some of this was religious music, and they would not have been able to do that just a few years earlier than that. But there were interesting pieces, and some of the things, well, there were whistling and clapping and like cracking a whip sort of sounds that the boys up there in the back row seemed to really enjoy. So the next slide then, on the left was a family that had stringed instruments, primarily balalaikas. And you can see the fellow in the middle was playing a bass balalaika, and the others were playing, it's like a mandolin, and the fellow on the right had a balalaika as well. And then on the right, this fellow made those, they're not pictures, they're actually embroidery pieces up in the, behind him in the background. And I bought a couple of those from him, and I've got one, and I hope there'll be time at the end to show you some of these things, and that would be one of them. But they were really dramatic, and I hadn't seen anything quite like that, and I haven't seen anything quite like that ever since either. They're interesting artwork in there. The next slide. We were invited to go to visit a summer camp called the Pioneer Camp for children of Snezinsk. It was out of town just a little bit, and there were kids doing all kinds of things. But we were greeted, when we came on in the little bus, we were greeted by these ladies, young women, with, and she's offering our group leader some bread with a little dish of salt up at the top. And this was a traditional welcome and greeting to people. And so that was very nice. But there were kids going around this camp area. It was spread out quite a bit. That on roller skis, sort of preparing to do cross-country skiing, but getting in shape for that. There were auto mechanics. They were racing their cars around a little circuit. A lot of young kids doing craft work. And I got a little lamb that one of the young kids had made. Some of them were doing computer programming kinds of projects, and even things like folding a parachute, and then they would later jump out of a plane with their parachute. So it was it kept them, they had a lot of things to do, and it clearly kept them busy, and they seemed to be perfectly happy doing a lot of these different kinds of things. Now, on the next slide, you can see on the left is some of the kids involving artwork and handcrafts and so on. And then on the right is what the countryside looked like around there. There are buildings, clearly farm type buildings and so on, but it was sort of rolling countryside, not very hilly, with a lot of trees in the area. The next slide, then we were treated to a special performance. Then sort of to wrap up the late afternoon or early evening, and on the left is the delegation from the U.S., and it was on a little bit of a rise and then dropped down 8 or 10 feet to a like a stage where you could look, and there were dancers and gymnasts who did things like that. And then on the other side of it was this MiG aircraft decorated with balloons and other kinds of fancy things. There were actually 2 MiG aircraft there. This is just one of them. But the real cute thing that happened there was somebody did a lip sync performance to a Michael Jackson piece anyway. And so they got a big charge out of that. And so that was a lot of fun. But when we left the place, remember I said that the Tsar bomb had this 8 or 10 foot diameter steel ball right in the upper end of things, the business end of things. There was one of those that was mounted right at the front of the entry to the pioneer camp, and it had engraved in it and etched in it the map of the world, the globe of the world. And I mean, the trip back from the pioneer camp to our hotel was just very quiet. Everybody was just really very impressed and stunned by what we had experienced out there. It was very, very interesting. The next slide, then I mentioned that Kasli is a place where a lot of heavy industry was done, and people made heavy equipment there, like I said, cannons and bridge abutments and things like that out of cast iron. But they also developed their own skills at making cast iron artwork. And these are a couple of examples of what we saw of their artwork abilities in Kasli, and they were really very nice. They're really very attractive. They're really pretty heavy, quite massive. And I've got a little bear here that I picked up and brought back. And I do have somewhere a gift that one of the gentlemen gave me of Don Quixote holding reading a book out of a book, and he has a sword, of course, in his side, and it comes out. You can tell it's a lot of delicate kinds of features, the things that you wouldn't necessarily expect out of cast iron. So the next slide then it shows that what happens on the last night of our visit. Well, there's a banquet, and the banquet is something else. But what you can see is on the right here, we all have T-shirts that have this. Well, it's ZATO, but that's the terminology for these isolated cities. And I didn't mention, but I should, that all of those 10 cities have populations of like 80 to 90,000 people in them, and they're very isolated, and you have to have special visas to get into them, to get access into them. And even the close relatives of people who work there have access, very limited access to those closed cities. They're typically out in the countryside, isolated, surrounded by fences, guarded fences, like what would have happened at what happened at Los Alamos during the 40s and early 50s. But the banquet then was sort of the climax, and I'll give you a couple of views of the food somewhat later on, but it was always very good. But the entertainment for the night was always toasts, and so it alternated toasts between the hosts in Russia and the visiting delegation, and there was always always vodka, and not at this particular one, but at another one where it was just the UNM group. Somebody counted that there were 37 toasts during the evening. And if you had drunk that just with vodka, I think you would have had a fatal dose of alcohol. So tried to water it down or slip something else in there instead, but they kept a pretty close watch on you. But and then at one of these, then when people got loosened up a bit, some of the men started singing some of these Russian ballads, which was really very neat, very interesting to see. Okay, next slide. Now, this is going back now to Moscow, and maybe some of you have heard that the Moscow subway or underground is quite a place. The thing on the left is the escalator going down a very long, deep hole underground, which I think was designed as bomb shelters. But the stations are all decorated, each one individually and uniquely. And that fellow on the right with the soccer ball is just one of the many, many features that are in the underground there. And it was each station, like I said, each station was different, and had a lot of artwork way down underground. So the next slide. Then we traveled on the underground for a ways and came up at Red Square. And so on the left is one of the views of Red Square with St. Basil's Cathedral in the background. And then over on the right-hand side is the wall of the Kremlin. And then on the right slide is St. Basil's. It's a fascinating place. Yeah, it's really unique with all of those really peculiar looking towers and domes and of course the Russian style cross on them as well. The next slide then shows it says Lenin right up above there. So that's where Lenin's tomb is. And so, that was one of the, just in the wall of the Kremlin. So that's the Kremlin is sort of an enclosed governmental city, sort of behind the walls anyway. And you can get in and out of that without too much trouble anyway. And we did have quite a nice visit in there. So the next slide. Well, this is a visit to what they call the flea market, and it's a permanent display of permanent display places where artists and artisans can sell their wares, and it's just booth after booth of handcrafts and all sorts of interesting features. This lady on the left had brooches that she had painted herself and was selling them. I got several of those and gave them to some of the friends here when we came back, to Susan and others. And you can see, of course, that some of the nesting dolls that are back on the right-hand side there. But I ended up getting and I hope I'll have time to show it to you, a little carved bear. And I got a note certifying that it was carved out of fossilized mammoth tusk. And so it's a special little treat that I've got anyway. The next slide shows there were performers who, on the left, who strolled around and sang. Just seemed like, I don't think it was a special day of any kind, but that was part of what they did. So these ladies sang some folk songs and were dressed up in these very interesting costumes. It looked like they were heavy enough to keep them warm, certainly. And then when the whole group got back to the hotel where we were staying, actually it was a Marriott hotel in Moscow where we were staying, and we laid out all of the stuff that we had bought during the day, and you can see, and we had quite a haul anyway. So there was again, a very interesting experience. And like I don't think I mentioned, but each of those trips that I made to Russia were about 2 to 3 weeks in length. And it was sort of a continual once-in-a-lifetime experience as we toured the different places. Excuse me. Next slide, please. And then we did go inside the Kremlin, and here is a picture of some gardens that are inside the Kremlin. Very nice, well-maintained, picturesque. This was, we were there in late August, so some of the things, certainly the early flowers were past, but they had all kinds of nice flowers and decorations around there anyway. And the next slide shows, I think there are like 4 cathedrals inside the Kremlin, along with a number of other special buildings, an armory which held all kinds of, displays of the elegance and the wealth of the Tsars from early on. So you can see their robes and the carriages that they were in, the dining, dishes and plates and service, and just a lot of really very elegant things. But these cathedrals were also very interesting. We didn't, we just poked our heads inside one of them because the time was getting kind of short. But you can see that they have those, clearly the onion dome with gold leaf on them, and then all of the kinds of crosses on the top as well. And you're just surrounded by this really very interesting artwork and displays that are there. And the next slide, then we did, in Moscow, we did visit another, well, it's not a closed city, not a secret city, but it was one of the facilities that was dedicated to the development of the neutron generators for their nuclear weapons programs. And we visited there for most of a day and had a luncheon there. And again, you can see that the hosts were always very gracious and kind, and you get, maybe a little bit of a sense of the kinds of food that were there. Sometimes it was pretty clear what you were eating, but other times it wasn't, and you just sort of ate it anyway. But one of the things that was, essentially universal for virtually every meal was cucumbers, sliced cucumbers, and tomatoes. And I'll get back to that again a little bit later on. Okay, the next slide. Now this is the Cathedral of Moscow. And on the left, it's the picture, or it's what we saw from taking a little boat trip on the Moscow River. The story behind this thing is really pretty interesting. It was built quite some time ago, and then during Stalin's era, one night he had it torn down, just completely demolished. And the idea was he wanted to put up a big, huge building there, a tower of some kind. And it turned out that the ground was too soft. It wouldn't support the thing. So what they did instead was put a reflecting pool. They had a tower at one end and a reflecting pool with the, where down for the, covering a lot of the rest of the area. Then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, one of the first things that the mayor of Moscow did was say, we're going to rebuild the cathedral. And so what you see here is the rebuilt cathedral, and the top, the gold colored material that's on the top is not gold anymore, but it's titanium nitride, which is a gold colored ceramic, and very tough and very hard. And if you go to, these days here, if you go to a place like Lowe's and look for drill bits, you can often find them, the ones that are coated with titanium nitride. So it's durable, hard, gold colored, and this is what they've used to replace the actual gold that was on the original cathedral. And the next slide then shows the entry to the cathedral, with its some of the decorations. And I went there a couple of times. Once was while it was really still under construction, and they had some very interesting displays down in the basement of the history and the story of the cathedral. And then later on again, when it was more nearly finished. So the next slide. Now, this is now in the town of Yekatrinburg, and this is on the site of the execution of the Romanovs. There was a building, a large office type building on the site originally, and that was torn down. And the site now has this little chapel, and here you see it in winter with the UNM delegation, and more in summer than with, I can't remember if it was with just the UNM, it may have been just the UNM group again, on our way to Snezinsk. We flew from Moscow to Yekatrinburg, and then drove down to Snezinsk, which is on the order of 50 or 60 miles. And in the wintertime, it was, we were in a small bus type affair, and it was after dark, after probably 4 p.m. And the bus broke down partway along the way. And it had the feeling it was sort of like something out of Dr. Zhivago, with the wolves circling the bus and so on. And the driver got a big crank out of the front end and started the bus going again, and we made it all the way to Snezinsk without any more problems. The next slide is some more of the features at the site of the Romanov execution, and that tombstone markers with the names of all of the Romanovs that were the last of the Tsars that were killed there, and then a little chapel there as well. Okay, the next slide was we made a visit to the Ural State University, Technical University, and visited an engineering dean. And so on the left are me and an interpreter, David Wolf from the UNM Physics Department, Denise Wallen from the Office of the Vice Provost for Research, and then Greg Gleason from Political Science. And they visited the dean, and he went into his closet and got out his academic garb, and we had to have a toast of vodka, and he called it salted cucumbers, which were pickles. So that was kind of fun. But David Wolf and I had the chance to clamber around underneath and through a cyclotron that was part of their facilities. And I'll try to show you then later on what this sample of this plexiglass thing that has frozen lightning, if they call it, and I'll show you that at the end of the presentation. Okay, in the next slide, we had talks with the Russian folks about what we might do, came up with a memorandum of understanding about what UNM would try to do to help get them prepared to do commercialization of some of their ideas and information. And so on the left is me with two of the people on the left, far left is Boris Vodolaga, and then Nikitin in the middle, and just agreeing to be friends with each other. And I've got to say that there was a lot of promise and hope for things to develop well, but the programs by our Congress were funded at such irregular levels that you couldn't really sustain a program with that. One year the program would be funded at $30 million, and the next year it'd be 10 million, and it was back and forth like that. So there was sort of a continual tug between our congressmen, some of whom would like to just rub the Russians' noses in the dirt always, and others who felt like we should try to develop things a little bit more friendly than that. My feeling is that there are two countries on Earth that have the capability of delivering megaton-sized devices virtually anywhere on the globe within 30 minutes or so, and the least we could be doing is talking to each other. But on the right, then, you can see Nikitin has a UNM Lobos cap. That was a gift to him, and so we had gift exchanges, and he seemed to get a charge out of that. He enjoyed doing that. So the next slide. Now, this was with the UNM delegation in winter, and you can see everybody's all bundled up there. And on the left is David Wolf, Denise Wallen, and on Greg Gleason. And the woman in the middle she said she was a mathematician who was unemployed since she was selling shawls that she wove. And Greg has one of them, and on the far right, then you can see I've got one as well. I bought that very nice, soft, like lamb's wool shawl. And yes, that is a McDonald's. We were in a very elaborate shopping center with a food court. And one of the things down there was a McDonald's. And so it was kind of intimidating. They don't make lines like we're accustomed to. So you sort of have to elbow your way in and place your order and get your stuff. And our colleague, Denise Wallen, I had never seen her intimidated by anything before, but that really got her. She didn't know quite what to do. And the next slide. Now, again, a little bit different trip, but this was in the summertime with the Los Alamos, the Sandia folks. And on the left, it's us in front of the Bolshoi Theater. The woman in the red dress, or red outfit there, was our interpreter, and she was excellent. Everybody, everywhere we went, agreed that she was the best interpreter or translator, either direction, Russian to English or English to Russian, that we had. But the Bolshoi, the word Bolshoi really means a grand or great. So in our place, or in the US, it would probably be called the Grand Theater or Great Theater. And the slide on the right is what it looks like on the inside. It's just these vertical seating places, and there are only a few rows of seats at each place. And this is what it looked like from the right-hand side of where we were sitting. We went to a performance, and it was of an adaptation of a Chekhov play done to, well, there was an orchestra with music and ballet performance. It was a story of a young woman who got, well, in servitude to an older gentleman, and he was like a little green grasshopper bouncing all over the stage. But the significance that I wanted to mention here was just off to our left from here was sort of the main box seats, and Václav Havel was there, and he was the Czech president, and he was himself kind of a playwright, and very famous, very well known, and he had very special escort that evening, and he occupied the box of honor there, and had bodyguards all over the place. And when it was all done, they hustled him out to this caravan. Right, was right out immediately in front of the theater. They got in and they just took off, just lickety split, just right away. So it was an interesting experience for several reasons. Okay, the next slide then is in red square. I'll just show you some of the other people who were dressed up as they were guards in old style costume and colorful. But they certainly didn't seem to mind having their pictures taken. The next slide. Now, this is going to Sarov. And Sarov is the Russian Los Alamos. And like I said, you had to have special visas to get into the place. And it was an overnight train ride. It was always an overnight train ride, about 250 miles east of Moscow. And there are the trains, and the train that was going to Sarov had a couple of cars where the people who were going to Sarov occupied, and the train went out, and I think it was on the Trans-Siberian Railway out there at about 200, like you said, 250 miles or so, and dropped off the cars that were going into Sarov. And an hour or so later, an engine came from Sarov out and pulled those cars back in, and you had to go through special security checks there, and right at the gate to the city, and they had to have special, well, you had to have transportation, and that was provided, ahead of time, or arranged ahead of time. And then on the right, when we were there this time, it was either the end of April or early May, so there weren't any leaves out on the trees yet. But here's one of the horse-drawn carriages that you could see, and you can see that the trees aren't leafed out yet. The grass isn't green, but it was, was interesting. The next slide shows on the left, Sarov was a sacred city earlier, and it had a monastery on the top of a hill, and that was largely destroyed. And I don't remember exactly what drove the destruction of it, but it was, I think it predates the Soviet era, but it was largely destroyed. And one of the things that has remained was this bell tower on the model there. It's the feature on the left-hand side, and then on the slide on the right, there's the bell tower that stands over the town, over the river that flows through the town, and you can see that from all over the place. But it was taken over then as by the Soviets and converted to this laboratory for the development of the nuclear devices. The next slide shows that tower again from up close, and it is sort of an icon of the city. And they display it on a lot of their artwork. Next slide. Their hero, the local hero, is Saint Seraphim of Sarov, and that's a statue to him. And he was known for being in constant service to people and praying. And where we stand there by that tree was one of his preferred spots or favorite spots for praying. And it was out of town a little ways, but he would walk through snow or mud or whatever it was and offer his prayers. The next slide then is a visit to the home of Yuli Khariton, who was known as the Russian Oppenheimer. That's his picture in the upper left above that radio device. And he had died about a year before we got there. And this fellow in the middle on the right-hand side was a butler or something to him, and was obviously just very dedicated to Khariton. And this is Khariton's office with a lot of the books and papers in the background. And many of those were books that I'm familiar with from physics and chemistry. Khariton had actually gotten a degree at Oxford. I think it was Oxford, yes. So he spoke English very well. And subsequently, I talked to Sig Hecker, who was director of Los Alamos during much of this period when Sarov just opened up. And he said, when he told me that when he flew into Sarov on a small plane, and Khariton was there to greet him, and they greeted him by saying, "I've been waiting 40 years for this day." And then, so they went inside and talked about science and other things, and Khariton had told them about how they had knew how many, where they could make a lot of improvements on the nuclear weapons over what ours was. And so Siggy asked him, well, if you knew you could make all these improvements, why did you use ours as your test one? And he said, we knew yours worked and we wanted to live. So it was a pretty dramatic story there too. Oh, and I also wanted to mention that thinking back to that model of the monastery, there's a museum up there, and I got a chance to tour that. And this was on another trip when I was essentially by myself, and we're given this tour by the librarian who was there, and she pointing out all different kinds of things. And I asked her then, I had just recently read a book called The Stalin Bomb by Holloway, David Holloway. And I just asked her if she knew about the book and if it was, I just wanted to know if it was an accurate portrayal of what their program was like. And she said, no, she didn't know anything about the book. And so we went on through, and the tour included a little video of dropping that big, huge Tsar bomb, and having it slowed down by some parachutes that were on it, and then the sudden flash of when it went off, and some seismographs just showing how the earth just really rang like a bell for a long time after that blast. It was just so hard. And then as we were getting ready to leave, she pulled me off to the side and said, yes, or whispered quietly, yes, she did know that Holloway book and it was accurate. So she had to be cautious about what she said, even in her place of work there. The next slide. Now, the fellow on the left is a guy named Meshkov, and one of the instabilities in the nuclear devices is called a Meshkov instability that he had discovered. And he was interested in trying to have some UNM students remotely use his equipment from Albuquerque, but in Sarov. And we tried to set it up, but it just really didn't work. This was in the early days of being able to have long distance communications like that. And what we found out was that while we could have video conferences and so on, the signal went through 28 different routers between Sarov and Albuquerque, and the video and the audio got out of sync. And so it was really not, it didn't work very well. It was interesting to do, but it was not amenable to being able to perform and experiment directly. And the lady in the middle was our interpreter. And then on the right, more balalaikas and pianos. We got performances from school kids just about everywhere we went. The next slide. This now was one the I found out that the lady who was the principal of the schools for handicapped children were interested in trying to find out how we did things with handicapped children. And this lady was N.Belyanina on the left. And she is displaying an outfit that was used for kids that had trouble with their limbs anyway. And so they would put this on them and tie strings to their shoes and so on to try to help them get to move. And then on the right is some of the kids there from this school. And I mean, you can see, it's evident that there are, some of them have physical handicaps and so on there. But the next slide shows what the environment was like. It was really colorful and picturesque, and it looked like they had a lot of interesting things for the kids to do and to play with, so that it was not a dull gray kind of affair. So Nina and a colleague visited here, and we did take her around and show her how we do some things with handicapped children, because Susan was involved with that. And and we eventually wrote a proposal trying to get funding for her to do some things. And while that was not successful, I did see her later, and she said she had was modeling or there in Sarov some of the things that she had learned when she visited Albuquerque. So the next slide just shows a little bit. There was all kinds of handcrafts, embroidery, and so on all around these places. And this is just an example of that. Lots of red, colorful flowers, and sometimes some animals and so on. Just very, very pretty. Next slide. Now, just outside of Sarov is a convent, and the church in the convent is what's pictured on the left, and then a little bit about it. We did visit there, and there was a service in progress while we visited, and I would have liked to have stayed longer to catch more of the service, because it was just, very different from what we're accustomed to. But we had to move on anyway. And then this is some of the cemetery with some of the markers on the grave sites of some of the prominent people at the convent. The next slide, next slide. And the entertainment for the evening was billiards. And billiards and pool are pretty similar, but there are distinct differences. But it was a great way to learn how to count to 21 in Russian. And the next slide is now leaving Sarov and catching the train going back to Moscow. Again, we had to take a train out, dropped off, and then the main train coming through would pick up the cars and take us back into Moscow, another overnight trip. And that's what some of the countryside looked like around there. Next slide. And I've got a couple of slides here of food type things. On the left is a fellow very interested in selling us a bunch of caviar. And there's fish, some sturgeons, and other kinds of fish. And then this on the right was an open air vegetable market. They were all done neatly and very colorfully picturesque. A lot of pickled things, beets and garlic, and certainly cucumbers, and lots of tomatoes all over the place. The next slide. On the left, this fellow has, more starchy type things, but the things hanging down are where there are bulges, those are nuts underneath there, and then it's fruit juice drizzled over that and dried. So it's sort of like fruit leather with nuts in the middle of it. And according to the stories, this was what the soldiers in Genghis Khan's army carried with them so that they could have some food, food to eat during the daytime while they were traveling for nourishment, and so they wouldn't have to stop and fix a lunch and things like that. So this was just for food on the go. And then some more open market kind of things there. Next slide. And this is what meals looked like. On the left, it was breakfast in Zheleznogorsk, where you can see in the front there tomatoes and cucumbers. That was a constant fare. Zheleznogorsk now is way out in Siberia, and we had breakfast with our hosts there and had time to spend talking about a lot of things. And this was while we were bombing in Kosovo, and that was one of the main topics of the conversation. And while the conversations were intense, there was no belligerence in them anywhere, but we had some very interesting conversations with those folks. And then on the right is a platter with lots of different samples of food that we were served. Like I said, sometimes it was clear what it was, and sometimes it wasn't. The next slide shows this was May. This was around the 8th or 10th of May. And if you look through beyond the church there's a lake, and it's frozen yet at this point. We did go out on that, so the ice was not rotten yet. It was still thick enough to hold us. But there was a church that was under construction in Zheleznogorsk. Now, Zheleznogorsk was a site of 3 plutonium production reactors that were buried inside a mountain. And the Yenisei River flowed north past the mountain. And the way we figured out there was something going on from there was that upstream from the mountain, the river was frozen, and downstream it was thawed. So there was an awful lot of heat being put out somewhere. And it turns out there were 3 plutonium production reactors operating there. By the time I was there, 2 of them had been decommissioned, and the third one was still in operation because it produced heat and electricity for the city. The next slide. The obligatory statue of Lenin in the main square in Zheleznogorsk with us in front of that. The next slide. I had a banya experience there. A banya is the Russian version of sauna. And they say there are differences. I'll say, well, okay, there probably are, but they escaped me. But all of us, had this banya experience. And remember, this was early May, and there were no leaves out on any of the trees, but they had birch switches with leaves on them where you beat yourself while you're in the banya itself. And one of the fellows who was there with us, it's actually the guy in the right-hand slide there seemed to get a little bit more pleasure out of beating us Americans than I thought was necessary. And you can see that, just take a look at him a little bit. It seemed like he'd been on a lot of barroom brawls in his life. So it probably fit. But we capped off the banya experience and swim in the pool with some beer and pickles, of course. The next slide. Now, this is in the museum in Zheleznogorsk, and that had a number of interesting things in it. A lot of it was dedicated to the reactors that were there and describing how they were built and how they were operated. And that's what this slide is all about. And there were things about how the process went for decommissioning the reactors as well. And we asked something about, well, where was this entrance to the mountain? And they said, oh, we're not supposed to tell you that, but if you go down the road about a kilometer, you can see where the tracks go into the mountainside. So we were pretty close to that. And the next slide then shows some of the things from the museum, and these were what the Siberian people did for artwork and decorating their homes for the long cold winters that they have. A lot of colorful stuff. Next slide is again the interior of a house in Siberia. And they're pretty low ceiling, that good heating capabilities and so on, a lot of resources, but you can see that it's like log houses with chinks between the logs that are there. But it's very, very nicely done. And the next slide, and this is the last of the slides that I've got, and it was a diorama that showed the Yenisei River flowing north, and over on the left-hand side behind our interpreter, you can see an entrance there, which is an entrance to the mountains where the reactors were installed. But what's not shown is off on the right-hand side, there was this very strange door with a small window with bars over it. And we asked, what was that about? And the answer was, that's where the prisoners were kept that worked in the mines. So all of a sudden, there's nice, friendly people, and this is the gulags were right there. Okay, well, that's the end of my slides, and I've got a few minutes, and I'd like to take the opportunity to show you some of the things that I picked up along the way. And I think you can see this. I mentioned that there was this fellow that did embroidery, and I got a couple of these things that are flowers that he had embroidered. It may not even look like that, but you get up close to it and it's clear it's embroidery. It was really fascinating, done very well. And then here is a cast iron bear that I got in Kasli, where they do the ironworks. And this just as a reclining bear, which is interesting and nice. And then here's that little bear that's said is carved from, well, I've got this slip of paper that says it was carved from a fossilized mammoth tusk. But it's done, again, just very neatly. I got that at that flea market in Moscow. And then I told you, this David Wolf and I from physics, we got to clamber around underneath a cyclotron. Well, what they had, one of the things that they do is take a block of plexiglass and put it in the electron beam that's going around in the cyclotron, pump it full of electrons, and then shut off the beam and short circuit the thing to ground. And what's produced then is this, I don't know if you can see it very well or not, but the electrons all come out and they leave this pattern behind there, and they call it frozen lightning. But it's quite distinctive. It's like a fractal, three-dimensional fractal image on the inside of this plexiglass. And then you've probably seen things like this, but it's optical glass, optical glass with laser produced figures on the inside. This one has a cross inside it. It's kind of hard to see, but they had all kinds of things like that were I thought they were pretty unique. We hadn't seen any like that before. Then here's a little bear with a balalaika, like the ones that we saw in Snezinsk, carved out on in the park. I've sort of made it a practice of collecting bears on my travels, and at least in the northern hemisphere, most of the countries have bears in them, and they have interesting ways of featuring the bears. And then this is the scarf that I got from that lady who said she was an unemployed mathematician. And it's just a very nice, soft, like lamb's wool scarf. It's very nice to have when it's chilly outside. And I said, in Sarov, the bell tower is sort of the icon for the city. And you can see that on this container, which in fact is designed to hold a bottle of vodka. And then here's another little, just decorative, as far as I'm concerned, it's just a decorative piece from Sarov, and it has the bell tower on it, along with just a pretty little turned wood piece. And at the Ural State University, this is a block of wood that it was pressed with an icon on it by some of the engineering students there. And it's, again, really pretty distinctive sort of thing, but the icons are obviously very important to the Russians, and the Orthodox religion just survived in spite of all of the complications and of the best efforts of the Stalin era folks to squelch it. And then here is something really quite distinctive as well. It's a sheet of steel, but it has etched with different kinds of acids, and they end up with a very interesting picture on the surface of this sort of thing. And again, I hadn't seen anything really quite like that over here. So that was very nice. And then this is an egg that was brought to us by this N.Belyanina when she visited here. And it has inside it another egg, and this one has a bell inside it. It's sort of like, it's like an Easter egg. It's decorated on the surface, and it says Sarov in Cyrillic letters there on the surface of it. And then one last thing is something that's really quite common there is birch bark. There are a lot of birch trees that make things out of birch bark. And this is a little container that I got in Krasnoyarsk, and it shows the bear pulling the nucleus apart. And so that was out in Zheleznogorsk, about sort of a representation of what, it's sort of, again, sort of an icon for the city anyway. So anyway, that's what I have to say. Thank you for your patience. I don't know if we've got time for questions, but if you want to ask questions separately later or independently, I'm happy to try to provide any answers I can. And again, thank you for your patience.
Ed, I have a question. This was wonderful, really marvelous and thank you very much. What was the dates or the years that you were, the range of years that you were there at these different places?
In 1998 to 2004.
Oh, okay. Not so long. Oh, that's wonderful. So really marvelous to see. And Václav Havel, and did you get a chance to see him?
No, we didn't. Well, maybe his backside, but that was about it. He had all these bodyguards all over the place.
That was, must have been very exciting though.
Oh, it was, yeah. Like I said, it was just sort of, when you were there, it was just sort of continual once in a lifetime experiences.
And may I ask one more question? What was your position? What was your position there at,
I was the special assistant to the associate provost for research. And if your title has to have that many words in it, it's not too important.
Research in atomic and nuclear, in other words.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was effectively a liaison between UNM and the national labs, Los Alamos and Sandia.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I don't know how many more questions we have. I'm willing to stay, and if you need to leave, I understand. But it was a marvelous presentation, Ed. And aren't you all amazed at how we've had so many of these, that we have so much experiences in our group at St. Luke that we can just learn so much just from each other.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I may, Ed, twice you showed nuclear museums.
Yeah.
Or at least a room or a piece of it.
Right.
And here, I mean, we have the Atomic Museum and it's wide open to the public. Are these kind of museums there for the public? I'm thinking not, because they're in closed cities.
They're in closed cities, and in fact,
impress visitors.
In the one in Snezinsk, we had to go through another security check to get inside there. And then they had a log book that you filled in. The one in Sarov was not as restricted as that.
Thank you.
Ed, I was wondering, since you were in these hidden cities, how were you able to take pictures?
Well, had to ask our escorts, and we had escorts everywhere we went. And you know, Igor was there, big, huge guy, and so I asked him if he could take pictures, and yes. So some of the times, generally speaking, they were okay. I mean, it looked like we weren't trying to do anything out of line at all. But yes, there were a couple of instances where we asked not to take pictures.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, I hope you have all read a little, and you'll see some more in the horizon about our Elders Alive plans for December. We're having a Christmas story party. And so I won't go into detail on that because Pastor Chuck has written a great description. I love it, and it'll be in the horizon. But you'll all get a chance to find pictures and tell your own stories of favorite things that happen at Christmas for you. So I think you'll really enjoy that. And then I think in January, we're hoping to have a presentation from Lutheran Family Services. So we have lots of good stuff going on. Don't forget to email us if there's something you really have as a suggestion. But thank you again, Ed, for really quite a wonderful presentation. We've had some really great
Thank you.
series.
Thank you, Ed. That was great.
Thank you, Ed.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.
Very much enjoyed. Thank you.
Great.
Well, gonna say goodbye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Betty.
Thank you, Judy and committee.